the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
History as it happens, July 2nd, 2024. The Chennault Affair.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
There is no need to delay the talks that could bring an end to this long and this bloody war. Mrs. Chennault is contacting their ambassador from time to time.
After 3 weeks of endless consultations and seesawing diplomatic intrigues, the moment for the announcement had come.
That all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease as of 8 a.m. Washington time.
Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign.
That's right.
And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
Only a week before the 1968 election, President Lyndon Johnson made a momentous announcement. He would stop the bombing of North Vietnam because Hanoi had agreed to peace talks. But then the South Vietnamese let it be known they would not join them. What the American people did not know at the time was why. The dirty tricks of Tricky Dick. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Well, the 68 election was a truly pivotal one, and that is thanks largely to the political skill, the political mastery of Richard Nixon. It also illustrates why the Logan Act is an essential, though often belittled law and almost never enforced law. And that's the law that's supposed to prevent Americans from sabotaging foreign policy negotiations by the U.S. government. And finally, it's just a great yarn.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. No other question.
Lyndon Johnson's televised address on March 31st, 1968 is best remembered for its stunning conclusion when he told Americans he would not seek another term. He began his remarks with news that may have also taken some of his audience by surprise. The United States would unilaterally and dramatically scale back the bombing of North Vietnam and would stop the bombing entirely if Hanoi agreed to enter peace talks.
Even this very limited bombing of the North could come to an early end if our restraint is matched by restraint in Hanoi.
In secret, Johnson held the North Vietnamese to 3 conditions. For instance, stop shelling South Vietnamese cities, which Johnson did not expect the North to agree to. But then, in October, as Democrat Hubert Humphrey was gaining ground on Republican Richard Nixon in the polls, Hanoi signaled they were ready. And on October 31st, 1968, President Johnson let the American people know.
Last Sunday evening and throughout Monday, we began to get confirmation of the essential understanding that we had been seeking with the North Vietnamese on the critical issues between us for some time. Now, as a result of all of these developments, I have now ordered that all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease as of 8 a.m. Washington time, Friday morning. I have reached this decision on the basis of the developments in the Paris talks, and I have reached it in the belief that this action can lead to progress toward a peaceful settlement of the Vietnamese war.
This is the story of the Chennault Affair, Anna Chennault, on behalf of Richard Nixon, contacted representatives of the South Vietnamese government with a message. Don't join the peace talks because the Democrats will sell you out the way Truman sold out China. Wait a little bit, because with a Richard Nixon in the White House, he'll get you a better deal at the negotiating table. So Johnson announced the bombing halt. The South Vietnamese announced they would not go to the peace talks in Paris. A few days later, Nixon won, Humphrey lost.
The late, tired hours of last night or the early, tired hours of this morning, Richard Nixon won the election this time where 8 years ago he lost it in Illinois. It was so close it took forever, but he won it, and in winning that, he won the presidency.
I also told him that as he finished this campaign that I know exactly how he felt. I know how it feels to lose a close one.
During the tense weeks of late October, Lyndon Johnson discovered that Anna Chennault of the China lobby was up to no good. She was interfering in U.S. diplomacy to help Nixon's candidacy. As LBJ revealed to Senator Richard Russell in a phone call the day before the bombing halt announcement.
Well, Mrs. Chennault, you know, well, I don't know that he has anything except just generally that lobby. It may be Walter Judd. I know it's her. Miss Chennault, you know, of the Flying Tigers. She's young and attractive. I mean, she's a pretty good-looking girl. And she's around town. And she is warning them to not get pulled in on this Johnson move. Then he, in turn, is warning his government.
And in another call to Senator Everett Dirksen on November 2nd, 3 days before the election.
Are some of our folks, including some of the old China lobby, are going to the Vietnamese embassy and saying, please notify the president that if he'll hold out till November the 2nd, they could get a better deal. Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign. That's right. And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I don't.
But Lyndon Johnson did not go public with this information. He suspected Nixon was behind it, but he did not have watertight evidence to prove it. Such evidence has since emerged, although the Chennault Affair and whether Nixon committed a crime remains the subject of intense historical disagreement. The best book I've read about it is Chasing Shadows, The Nixon Tapes, The Chennault Affair and the Origins of Watergate by Ken Hughes of the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. He is the master of the Watergate and Presidential Audio Tapes Archive. Ken Hughes, welcome back to the Washington Times.
Thank you, Martin DeCaro. It is great to be here.
You're one of my favorite guests, not because your book was so illuminating about the Chennault Affair, but you come in and see me. We can sit in this nice, comfortable studio together. It's not a Zoom screen. So the Chennault Affair, right? As you know as you listen to the podcast, I try to link a lot of my topics to what's going on today, try to make it relevant to the headlines. Is there a way to link the significance of this affair that most people don't know that much about? It's not like Watergate, which came after. Is there a way to link this to today's headlines? I mean, what's the significance?
Well, the 1968 election was a truly pivotal one, and that is thanks largely to the political skill, the political mastery of Richard Nixon. It also illustrates why the Logan Act is an essential, though often belittled law and almost never enforced law. And that's the law that's supposed to prevent Americans from sabotaging foreign policy negotiations by the U.S. government.
Has there ever been a conviction?
Not
I don't think so.
The 20th or 21st centuries. And finally, it's just a great yarn that everybody should know. You've got these two titans of American politics, Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, and they are having this massive behind-the-scenes struggle. And it's sort of politics as Hollywood imagines it. It's cloak and dagger stuff. It's deceiving the public over a great deal of important activities. Someday someone will turn it into a really great limited series.
Well, we did talk once about The Plumbers, the comedy series on HBO, or was it called White House Plumbers? I can't remember the name of the series. So maybe they can do something about this tragic comedy. Well, I suppose if we can conclude, and we'll get to this, the Chennault Affair what Nixon did here affected the outcome of the election, then definitely, right? Because 1968 was an important election. Who won there really did matter. Although now we're getting into counterfactuals. I mean, who knows how Hubert Humphrey would have prosecuted the war in Vietnam? I can't say for sure. I actually don't know all that much about Humphrey, other than he was the loyal lieutenant of Lyndon Johnson, and that really hurt him during the run-up to the election because he didn't come out forcefully against his own boss's policy during the Vietnam War, right?
Yeah, the relationship between Johnson and Humphrey is really important. But I want to get back to the first thing you mentioned, which was whether this really made a difference in the outcome of the election. There's a strong argument made by a lot of people that it made no difference when Johnson announced the bombing halt because the election was already tight on October 31st, 1968, which was just, less than a week before the election. And therefore, it didn't make any difference. I take the opposite view. It started to make a difference earlier in the month. Nixon went into October of 68 with a 15-point lead.
15,
yeah. He was heading for a landslide victory. And everything about 1968 would make you think that the Republicans are going to have a landslide victory. It was a time of rioting at home, unsuccessful war abroad. It was the year of the Tet Offensive. It was the year of Bobby Kennedy's assassination and Martin Luther King's assassination, which was followed by widespread urban disturbances.
Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen, and police report that the murder has touched off sporadic acts of violence in a Negro section of the city. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind...
So Nixon then ran on the Law and Order.
Nixon ran on Law and Order, and the Democratic Convention was outside. It was chaotic.
And they're having it this year in Chicago. There might be chaos again, hopefully not on the same level.
Yeah, but probably not on the same.
Go ahead.
Near on the same level. But anyway, I mean, it looked like a year where the Republicans were just going to clobber the Democrats. But in October, things changed on the international scene when the North Vietnamese started to show an interest in a bombing halt deal with Lyndon Johnson. And there were leaks that Johnson was going to halt the bombing and the North Vietnamese were going to sit down for serious peace talks.
So prior to the actual announcement of the bombing halt, this was in the air. That's what your point is.
It was in the air. It was in the news. It looked like Johnson's stand firm policy was finally bearing fruit, that the North Vietnamese, who had said, no, we want an absolute unconditional bombing halt for most of the year, were starting to weaken and say, okay, we'll do what LBJ wants us to do. And so during that month, by the time the middle of the month came around, Nixon's lead was cut in half to just 8 points. And by the weekend before the election, his lead had basically evaporated. It was within the margin of error in the Gallup poll.
Why did this help Hubert Humphrey?
Because Hubert Humphrey was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and his fortunes were tied to Lyndon Johnson's. I guess as we can go back to what started the bombing halt as an issue at all.
Because Lyndon Johnson was unpopular. I mean, that's another big part of this crazy year. He announces, and we're going to get to the announcement on March 31st. That speech was about something else, and then he added out in the end, oh, by the way, in a sense, I'm not going to run again. Yes. So, vice presidents are always overshadowed by their president. So I'll let you continue. What is the explanation as to why this helped Humphrey?
The night that Lyndon Johnson announced that he wasn't going to run again, he created the biggest issue of the 1968 election. Like you said, the speech was about something else. It was about Vietnam.
Yeah, and the bombing, yeah.
Johnson announced that he was going to limit the bombing of North Vietnam to just one area directly north of the demilitarized zone that divided Vietnam in half. He was halting the bombing everywhere else in the country and would halt it entirely if it led to prompt and productive peace talks. He didn't specify what that meant. The North Vietnamese surprised him with their reaction. Instead of just outright rejecting his proposal, the North Vietnamese said, okay, we'll talk to you. We'll negotiate with you about having an unconditional bombing halt. What's there to talk about if you're demanding an unconditional bombing halt? What is there to negotiate? And so Johnson has a choice. He can either be the bad guy who refuses to talk to the North Vietnamese, or you can say, yeah, we'll talk with you.
This is how negotiations are, right? You start with your maximalist, and then you work towards the middle, but go ahead.
Johnson's advisors say, we can't insist explicitly on conditions, but we can rephrase what you want diplomatically and call it facts of life. So Johnson says there are 3 facts of life that the North Vietnamese have to accept before he'll halt the bombing. 1, the North Vietnamese have to respect the demilitarized zone. The reason Johnson is bombing just north of the demilitarized zone is that's where the North Vietnamese army is. If he stops bombing and they haven't agreed to respect the DMZ, then they'll cross the DMZ and they'll kill American soldiers who are on the southern side of the DMZ. So that's his first condition.
Okay, and this is after Tet, right?
Yeah, this is after the Tet Offensive.
Okay, all right.
It's earlier in 68. It kind of destroys the narrative that Johnson had been creating in 67 and 68 of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel.
That's right.
We've turned the corner in Vietnam, and we're coming in on success, on victory.
Yeah, I think Walter Cronkite, the story is he shouted across the newsroom, I thought we were winning this war. We were told we were winning this war. How could this be possible, even though the offensive was a failure, right?
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
What were the other 2 conditions? March 31st, 1968, the conditions that LBJ lays down after his speech.
Conditions that he secretly lays down in negotiations with the North Vietnamese because he is keeping it on the QT.
That's right. He doesn't announce them in the speech on TV.
He wants to keep the possibility of a negotiated agreement alive by saying these are just facts of life. The second fact of life is the North Vietnamese have to agree to negotiate directly with the South Vietnamese in Paris, where the U.S. and the North Vietnamese are then speaking. And finally, he wants the communist forces to stop shelling civilians in South Vietnamese cities. That's terror shelling. It doesn't have military value. It's just to strike terror into the hearts of the South Vietnamese. Johnson's idea is if I'm halting the bombing, you have to halt the shelling, which is bombing, of South Vietnamese civilian populations. And he says, I don't have to call them conditions. I don't have to make them public, but you have to accept them in order for me to stop the bombing. The North Vietnamese say, no, we want an unconditional bombing halt.
Because they would use that to their advantage, right? Regroup and get ready for the final onslaught, so to speak?
Yeah, the North Vietnamese, they're not interested in peace. They're interested in getting the Americans out of there. And they don't want to give up their military advantages. They do a lot of infiltration from the north. They do a lot of shelling of the South Vietnamese cities. They don't see a reason for them to accept Johnson's conditions until it becomes fairly clear that the guy who might replace Johnson, Richard Nixon, is well ahead in the polls. And he might actually take a harder line if his anti-communist reputation is accurate.
All right, so that's March 31st, 1968. I want to return to that speech. Chronology might get a little screwy here. We started off in October and the announcement of the bombing halt and why that helped Humphrey. Let's just back up a minute here. Who was Anna Chennault? I mean, why is this called the Chennault Affair?
Anna Chennault is one of the most fascinating figures in 1960s politics. She is unique. At a time when just about every delegate to the Republican National Convention was a white man, she was an Asian American woman who was very well connected at the top of Republican politics. That was for a variety of reasons. As a young woman, she had been a reporter in China before World War II and during World War II. That's when she had met Claire Chennault, a legendary figure in World War II. He was the general who ran the Flying Tigers volunteer air group.
She was born Chan Sheng Mei in 1920s nationalist China. So she meets Claire Chennault.
She meets Claire Chennault, who is married, but who doesn't stay married long. They marry after the war. And they eventually return to the United States after the Communist Revolution in China. This is the period of the China lobby, which blamed Harry Truman rather than the weakness of the Chinese nationalist government for Communist Mao Zedong's victory.
Yeah, so they're ardently anti-communist.
They're ardently anti-communist, and they're ardently against the Democrats, too. And they have a lot of allies in America because Who Lost China is a great issue for people like Richard Nixon and later Joe McCarthy.
That's red baiting.
It's red baiting.
As if China was ours to lose.
Right.
Yeah.
As if, we could possibly have kept it without going to war. And even then, there's no way.
Yeah, I mean, some aid was sent. There was an attempt, maybe not that effective, but yeah.
Yeah, we gave them a lot of aid. General George C. Marshall was Secretary of State at the time. The State Department put out a pretty convincing white paper saying, we could give them all the aid we want. It just wasn't going to work. But people, voters responded to the idea that it was the weakness of the State Department and Harry Truman's foolishness for taking their advice that led to this bad outcome.
Civil War won by the communists. So, yeah, that's the background to Anna Chennault.
So she comes to America with Claire Chennault because of the political potency of the China lobby. She makes a lot of great connections with top Republicans and conservative Democrats as well. The Democratic Party, let's remember, was a very diverse ideological party at the time. It had the most liberal members in the Northern Democrats and the most conservative to reactionary members in the Southern Democrats.
Anti-communist too, yeah.
They were strongly anti-communist too. So Anna Chennault, there's nothing apologetic about Anna Chennault. She comes to America, doesn't like any of the dresses, so she gets her own seamstress to make her Chinese clothing. She becomes a premier Washington hostess. Look magazine sends photographers to record her party preparation and do a photo takeout in one of the glossy magazines of the era.
So she was a businesswoman as well.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interject there. So she's in Washington now, and she's rubbing shoulders with powerful, influential people.
And she is an influential person herself. She's also very, very well connected in Asia.
Yes. Through her businesses, yeah.
And she is Richard Nixon's top female fundraiser in 1968. And she's also one of the 2 Asian delegates to the Republican National Convention that year, and the one Asian woman who's a delegate.
What was her interest in the outcome in Vietnam? Was it as simple as she didn't want to see another communist victory?
She didn't want to see another communist victory. Yeah, her view is very clear. Her idea of what causes communist victories is democratic administrations. Truman lost China. She thinks Humphrey will lose Vietnam. She doesn't think Nixon will lose Vietnam, and she will eventually learn that she overestimated Richard Nixon in that regard. But she is willing to go to great lengths to elect Richard Nixon because she thinks that Republicans are stronger anti-communists.
So that is why this is called the Chennault Affair.
Yes.
So March 31st, 1968, as we mentioned, the bombshell at the end of the speech.
Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
But the speech was really about Vietnam, right? And you could see LBJ so anguished about this disastrous decision, which costs him his presidency. This is difficult for any president to do, to basically look weak. But he's not going to run for re-election again, so he's going to dedicate the rest of his term to peace.
There is no need to delay the talks that could bring an end to this long and this bloody war. Tonight, I renew the offer I made last August to stop the bombardment of North Vietnam.
He lays out the 3 conditions in secret to the North Vietnamese. They initially say no. What was the nature of the negotiations? Were there negotiations between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese? Or was it simply, here are the conditions, I'll wait to hear back from you?
There were negotiations, but there was absolutely no progress between Johnson's announcement in March and the beginning of October.
Wow.
So Johnson, when he made those conditions, he really didn't think the North Vietnamese would accept them. They were in part his way of explaining to his own aides, why he's not going to halt the bombing. Because basically it would cost American lives. And this was something that the general in charge of U.S. forces in South Vietnam, Creighton Abrams, As long as they don't agree to our conditions, if you halt the bombing, it's gonna kill American boys.
Adams has taken over for Westmoreland at this point.
Johnson, in order to make sure that none of the presidential candidates undercuts him, starts bringing them all in to the negotiations confidentially.
So he tells Nixon secretly about the conditions.
He tells Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, his vice president, who he treats just about the same as he treats Richard Nixon. Humphrey is kind of humiliated by the fact that, while he's a member of the administration, he gets no more information than Richard Nixon. He's cut out of the distribution of classified documents, so that eventually William Bundy, who is in the State Department, is sneaking him classified information just so Humphrey knows what's going on. And he also brings George Wallace, the American independent, segregationist governor of Alabama, who, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, was trying to repackage himself as a conservative. He's running as an independent that year, and he's running really strong for a third party.
I did not know that Johnson looped him in.
He did. Wallace was getting 21% of the vote in polls in the middle of the year.
21%.
Yeah. So these guys, the presidential nominees, all know that there are these three conditions and that Johnson's not going to budge from them. And
so it's a surprise then when we get the announcement of the bombing halt on October 31st, because no one knew how close or how far away the North Vietnamese may have been.
What happens in October is the North Vietnamese delegation gets instructions from Hanoi.
And the delegation in Paris.
Saying, we want to make a deal. We want to take advantage of the contradictions in the Democratic Party. And the idea, as far as Americans can tell, is that they prefer Humphrey to Nixon. Humphrey is part of the Democratic Party's liberal wing. Humphrey privately opposed the escalation of the Vietnam War in 1965.
And are they assuming that if Humphrey wins, he'll continue the policy of the current administration, which at this point is to stop the bombing?
Or they think that, Humphrey will be more of a dove than Lyndon Johnson. So in October, the North Vietnamese, who have been completely intransigent throughout the year, saying we demand an unconditional bombing halt, they go to the Americans and say, well, what if we agree just to one of your conditions? What if we agree to talk to the South Vietnamese in Paris? And the U.S. delegation says, absolutely not. We need you to agree to all three of these. And if you do that, Johnson can halt the bombing and will. But if you violate any of those three facts of life, unacknowledged conditions, Johnson will resume the bombing. So in mid-October, the North Vietnamese say, you don't have to worry, we understand. So Johnson thinks that he can get together group phone call with all the presidential candidates on October 16th and tell them we're going to have a bombing halt. But little snags start to develop. Johnson says, okay, fine, I'll halt the bombing, and the next day the talks have to begin in Paris. And the North Vietnamese say, our negotiators are in the jungle in South Vietnam. We cannot get to Paris in a single day. You're imposing a new condition.
Why was Johnson insistent on having it start within 24 hours, to squeeze it in before the election?
Not so much to squeeze it in before the election, but because he knew how bad it would look halting the bombing 2 weeks before the election and not being able to explain why he was doing it.
Okay, credibility reasons.
Yeah. Not only was he not particularly enamored of his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, I think one of the best things about Robert Cairo's multi-volume biography of Johnson is the way it brings to the fore Johnson's fear of humiliation.
Yes.
Of the three people who could be elected president in 1968, the only one who could possibly humiliate Lyndon Johnson would be Hubert Humphrey if his own vice president took over the reins of the presidency, said Vietnam was a mistake. I've reviewed the whole thing and I'm going to make a deal and get us out of there. That would be a repudiation of Johnson by his own party and his own protege.
Because some historians have said this was totally cynical by LBJ, announcing the bombing halt on the 31st of October to begin with. But your argument is he did it because that's when the North Vietnamese suddenly, well, actually it was 2 weeks prior.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, here's the thing. Yeah. They agreed to these three conditions 2 weeks prior, but then they both start making these really petty demands. Johnson's petty demand is you have to be there in 1 day.
24 hours later,
and the
we
North
show up.
Vietnamese say, that's a fourth condition. You did not bring that up. And they say, we need 7 days. When Johnson gets the three guys, the three presidential candidates on the phone on October 16th, he has to say, I don't have a deal yet. But he also tells them, and this is going to become really important, we cannot say that they've met our conditions. We cannot claim that there was any reciprocity on their part. If we do that, it will destroy the deal. They've only agreed to accept these conditions as long as they don't have to acknowledge them in public.
Because they want to save face.
They don't want to, they don't want to look like they backed down.
Yes.
Which they're willing to do as long as they don't have to admit it. So Johnson says, I think this is on tape, so you might be able to play this.
Yeah.
I do not want you to lay down these points, because if you do, that causes them to say that they're conditions, and it's reciprocity.
We have been hopeful one day that they would understand this. We don't want to call it reciprocity. We don't want to call it conditions, because they object to using those words, and that just knocks us out of an agreement. But we know that you join us in wanting peace the earliest day we can, and to save lives as quickly as we can and as many as we can. So one day we're hopeful, and the next day we're very disillusioned. Now, as of today, they have not signed on and agreed to the proposition which I have outlined to you, nor have they indicated that this would be a satisfactory situation to them in its entirety.
This is the October 16th, 1968 phone call, President Johnson with candidate Nixon, candidate Humphrey, and candidate George Wallace. So because of these complications about a fourth condition, it's not until Halloween, October 31st, 1968, when Johnson actually announces the bombing halt.
Yes, and he gets talked into it by his hawks. The people who are recalled now as the architects of the war, people like National Security Advisor Walt Rostow, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, they say to Johnson, you have to make the deal now before the election, because we don't know if there will be a deal after the election. Right. Remember, they think the reason that the North Vietnamese are willing to make the deal is they favor Humphrey over Nixon.
Because they can't be sure who's going to win.
They can't be sure who's going to win.
Even though Humphrey's catching up, they can't be sure he's going to be there in a week.
After the election, if Nixon wins, they have no reason to make a deal.
Yeah. And the purpose of course, announcing the bombing halt is to have peace talks.
Yes.
But because of logistics or whatever reasons, the peace talks can't begin for a week after the election.
There's a lot of haggling in the last half of October of 68 because Johnson, again, wants to have the peace talks start as soon as they can. The North Vietnamese are scrambling to get a delegation together to talk with the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese introduced their own little extraneous demand. They say they want a secret minute that says that they had not met any of Johnson's conditions. Johnson won't accept that because he figures this secret minute will become a public minute as soon as it becomes convenient for the North Vietnamese. So Johnson finally gets all this stuff nailed down. They agree to a 3.5-day delay. They split the difference between 1 day and 7 days before the peace talks can begin. And he gets the top general, Creighton Abrams, in South Vietnam to come to the White House, to fly half around the world, to come to the White House in the middle of the night and convince him that the bombing halt is the right thing to do. And Johnson asks him very directly, should I halt the bombing? Abrams says, you absolutely should, though I know you'll be stepping into a cesspool of comment, meaning he's going to be raked across the calls by the Republicans because he's going to be halting the bombing for what looks like nothing except talks between the North and the South.
They're far apart, too, on settling the war.
Yeah, there's that looks extremely weak. Johnson can't say, no, I'm getting them to respect the DMZ and to stop shelling the South Vietnamese cities.
That's right. Got to keep the conditions secret.
Those have to stay secret. And Abrams is saying in secret in this classified meeting that, as soon as you halt the bombing, I can dispatch all the American troops that are currently guarding the DMZ to go on sweeps around the country. We can go on the offensive because we don't have to worry about the North Vietnamese crossing the DMZ. And besides, the rainy season is starting. There'll be so much cloud cover for the next 3 months that I can't send bombing missions to the North except for 1 or 2 days per month. So basically, the weather is going to halt the bombing. These are all things that if Johnson could say publicly, they'd sound great, but he can't He can't make any of that information public without destroying the bombing hall deal.
So let's just correct what I said before then. It wasn't that the peace talks were definitely going to start after the election.
They could have started the weekend before the election.
Okay.
I, as you probably have heard, have received a very gracious message from the Vice President congratulating me for winning the election. I have also had a telephone conversation with him, and I thought I might share with you and also our television audience some of the thoughts that I expressed to him in that telephone conversation. I congratulated him for his gallant and courageous fight against great odds.
So let's back up then to July of 1968.
Yes.
And I really do marvel about how you're able to make sense of all of this stuff. So just to prepare for this conversation, it was mind-boggling, right? To get the chronology right and the significance of this piece of evidence versus that piece of evidence. And you're doing all this detective work and digging up all this evidence and piecing it together. Really amazing. Just wanted to say that. So,
Thank you, kind sir.
July 3rd, 1968. I asked you earlier in the interview, why do we know this would have helped Humphrey? Well, obviously Nixon thinks it's helping Humphrey.
Yes.
Because he wants the South Vietnamese to reject the peace talks. So July 3rd, 1968, in your book, Chasing Shadows, you have a memo from Richard Allen. He was a foreign policy advisor to the Nixon campaign. He sends a memo to Nixon about having a meeting with the South Vietnamese ambassador. What was the purpose? And you dug up this document, a critical piece of evidence that Johnson was not aware of, right? He doesn't know this.
Right.
So what's the significance of this memo?
Do you want to read that?
Yeah. So this is what Richard Allen is telling Tricky Dicky. Possible meeting with South Vietnamese ambassador is the subject line. Talked with Mrs. Chennault, who is a longtime friend of Saigon's ambassador to the U.S., Bu Diem. He is now in Paris, designated official observer and representative of the South Vietnamese government to the peace talks. He is due back here in Washington next week sometime. Mrs. Chennault, the memo goes on, has apparently asked him if he would talk to D.C., that's Richard Nixon. I explained, schedule tight but possible to check on available time. Meeting would have to be absolute top secret. Initiative is ours. If Nixon can see him, I am to contact Mrs. Chennault. She will arrange.
And Nixon writes on that we have to keep it from the Secret Service. And that's really the most alarming part of it.
Because they're giving him protection as a candidate.
They're giving him protection as a candidate.
So they'll know what he's up to if he's meeting with the South Vietnamese.
What Nixon is afraid of is that the Secret Service is acting as spies for Lyndon Johnson, which they're not.
He was paranoid, I've heard. Go ahead.
He was a very suspicious man. He suspected that everybody else was secretly a lot like Richard Nixon.
Well, you know what they say about liars. They suspect everyone else is lying.
Yeah. Nixon wants to keep the secret. And it's not actually that scandalous for a major party nominee to meet with foreign officials.
Okay.
It does raise suspicion that he wanted to keep it secret. And once you read Anna Chennault's account of the meeting that she and Ambassador Diem had with Nixon and Nixon's campaign chairman, John Mitchell, you realize why. Nixon secretly designated Chennault as his representative to the South Vietnamese government for the duration of the election campaign.
So we got split track diplomacy. The presidential administration's doing diplomacy, and the candidate who's trying to replace him has his own diplomatic corps. So the July 12th, 1968 meeting in New York, Chennault, Bu Diem, the ambassador to South Vietnam, and Tricky Dick. This meeting is the subject of intense historical debate. You have drawn different conclusions about what came out of this meeting than other historians. What, in your view, was, say, decided upon here, and how do we know what actual impact it had on events?
The key point is that Anna Chennault was a go-between for Nixon and the South Vietnamese government. We have her word for that, and then we eventually have like FBI wiretap reports on the South Vietnamese embassy telephone that support.
So Johnson had an idea of some of this stuff, but not all of it.
But later on, Johnson seemed to have no idea of Nixon's
July meeting. Okay.
Yeah, so apparently the Secret Service were not acting as proper spies or improper spies. So the meeting takes place. According to Chennault, the way it works is that Nixon gives messages to Mitchell. Mitchell gives messages to Chennault, and Chennault gives them to the South Vietnamese embassy. The message is really clear. Don't take part in the peace talks. you'll get a better deal from Richard Nixon if he's elected president.
And in July, it certainly looks like that's going to be the case.
In July, it very much looks like Nixon is going to be elected president. And publicly, Nixon is saying, I will do nothing to interfere with the prospects of peace. We all want peace. Peace is the most important thing.
Peace with honor.
Peace with honor, yes.
Ahead, yeah.
That he would absolutely not interfere in any way with the peace talks. Nixon later was quite frank about how he thought that the bombing halt was the most important thing in the campaign. It created hopes for peace. People knew that Johnson had been hanging tough for 4 years. It seemed to be paying off in October when the North Vietnamese finally did agree to at least one of his demands.
How often did Anna Chennault press this point home? Was it 1 time, 10 times? I'm not asking you to give me a precise number, because other historians who have looked at this have said, you know, what she said really wasn't that big of a deal. There were other considerations. The South Vietnamese didn't need to hear from Anna Chennault to reject the peace talks. Basically, the strength of your evidence, other historians have attacked it.
For a long time, the evidence against Anna Chennault was conclusive, but the evidence against Richard Nixon was based on inference rather than direct evidence of his guilt. We at first found out about the Chennault Affair when we found out how Johnson learned of it. Johnson learned of it on October 29th, and the same night that he had General Creighton Abrams over to tell him, whether he should halt the bombing. And Abrams was very emphatic, yes, now is the time to halt the bombing.
I forgot to bring up this other phone call that Johnson has with Senator Russell. He finds out about it.
But that's coming up. First, he hears from Alexander Sachs, who is this legendary figure on Wall Street who's got a fantastic reputation. He is the person who went to Franklin Roosevelt to communicate Albert Einstein's concern that Nazi Germany would corner the world market on uranium and build an atomic bomb before the United States. And this, this warning is largely credited with the start of the Manhattan Project. Alexander Sachs was also credited with predicting the rise of Hitler and the banking crisis of 1933. So he was a guy whose warnings presidents took seriously. He approaches the Johnson administration on October 28th and says, I was at a meeting, a businessman's lunch with my Wall Street connections, and someone close to Richard Nixon said that Nixon is trying to scuttle the bombing halt talks. He's saying to both sides, the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese, hold on, I can give you a better deal.
Purely self-serving on Nixon's part, because he wants to defeat Humphrey.
Right.
The considerations about the war, the actual peace talks are secondary, but go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
He's not making any sort of commitment or coming up with a peace proposal. He's just saying, don't go with Johnson's. So Johnson starts reviewing his diplomatic intelligence. First, the CIA has a bug in the office of President Nguyen Van Thieu of South Vietnam. So he knows that the South Vietnamese favor Nixon. He also has the intercepts of communications between Ambassador Diem in Washington, the South Vietnamese ambassador in Washington, and his home government. Ambassador Diem is saying, I'm in touch with the Nixon entourage, including Anna Chennault. And so Johnson, getting this intelligence, says, I want the FBI to put a wiretap on the South Vietnamese embassy phone to tell me the identities of everybody who enters and exits the South Vietnamese embassy, to tail Anna Chennault, just follow her wherever she goes, and a fourth kind of surveillance, which the FBI did not put on, which is to tap Anna Chennault's phone at her penthouse apartment at the Watergate.
Wow.
Which is where she lives. The Watergate was a popular Republican spot at the time.
Who knew?
So
future home of the Democratic National Committee,
yes.
Right? Okay, go ahead.
Yes.
So Johnson wants every piece of info he can possibly get about what Chennault is up to when he hears about this from his friend Sachs on the 29th, 2 days before the bombing halt announcement.
And so the FBI, then run by J. Edgar Hoover, puts 3 of those 4 kinds of surveillance on, taps the embassy phone, tails Anna Chennault, and reports on everybody who enters and exits the South Vietnamese embassy. It doesn't tap Anna Chennault's home phone, which is unfortunate, because that would have...
For historians.
For historians, and for Johnson and Humphrey and possibly the United States, but because whatever calls that John Mitchell, Nixon's campaign chairman, made to Chennault on our home phone were never surveilled, and so we don't have any reports on them. The FBI's reason for doing that was just basically we'd get caught, and two, it would look really, really bad if we're tapping the phone of a top Republican political operative like Anna Chennault. The wiretap bears fruit very quickly. Johnson learns about Chennault's role in scuttling the bombing halt talks on October 29th. I think he gets the surveillance imposed on October 30th. And by November 2nd, the FBI wiretap produces a report overhearing Anna Chennault say to Ambassador Bouidiam that she just spoke to her boss, not further identified than that. And he says, hold on, we're going to win. So it's relatively explicit that she, speaking for Richard Nixon, is urging the South Vietnamese to boycott the peace talks. And that very day, Nguyen Van Thieu, the president of South Vietnam, announces publicly that he's not sending anybody to the peace talks.
Wow. What day was that again? Which date?
It's Saturday, November 2nd.
Saturday, November 2nd, President Thieu, Thieu, of South Vietnam, says we're not sending anybody to the peace talks. And in your mind, the cause and effect is established.
The cause and effect, and more importantly, in Lyndon Johnson's mind,
yes,
the cause and effect is established.
Well, on October 30th, he calls one of his mentors, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, to tell him about this. Nixon's screwing around behind my back.
Well, I've got one this morning that's pretty rough for you. We have found that our friend, the Republican nominee, our California friend, has been playing on the outskirts with our enemies and our friends both, our allies and the others. He's been doing it through rather subterranean sources here. And he has been saying to the allies that you're going to get sold out. Watch Yalta and Potsdam and two Berlins and everything. And they're going to recognize the NLF, and I don't have to do that. You better not give away your liberty just a few hours before I can preserve it for you. And Mrs. Chennault is contacting their ambassador from time to time.
Why didn't Johnson go public with it? I mean, I can understand why he didn't. It would have been crazy, but go ahead.
The reasons that he acknowledged were that he had gotten this information through the CIA and the NSA and finally the FBI. Alexander Sax's information, while it turned out to be very, very good, was still gossip.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't direct. He had nothing directly against Richard Nixon. That is really important. It's not until the 21st century that we get evidence directly against Richard Nixon, and I'll get into that as soon whenever you think
something. And he penned something on a piece of paper. Well, you already talked about that one.
That's the memo that took place over the summer.
Yeah,
and also he doesn't want to cripple Nixon's presidency if he's elected. He'll later say to Dean Rusk, if this gets out, it's the end of the war. And that's a factor. And I think an unacknowledged factor is he just is not that into Hubert Humphrey. He does not particularly want Hubert Humphrey to succeed him.
Really?
Yes, though he is.
But he doesn't want Nixon to win either, though.
He gets along better with Nixon throughout '68 than he gets along with Humphrey. Humphrey, he knows, wants to come out publicly for a bombing halt with or without any conditions. Humphrey makes a speech on September 30th saying that as president, he would halt the bombing. His aides tell newspaper reporters that he's breaking with Johnson, but Humphrey says to Johnson himself, no, I'm sticking with you.
Okay.
So he's basically coming out on both sides of the issue.
So when the South Vietnamese announced they're not going to go to the peace talks, it cuts down Humphrey's momentum that he'd been building.
In Richard Nixon's judgment, this is why he won the election. If Thieu had not boycotted the peace talks, Nixon thinks that the momentum started by the bombing halt negotiations and the announcement would have buoyed Humphrey to victory. Because remember, there was this enormous change. Nixon went from starting the month of October with a 15-point lead to, by the weekend before the election, being within the margin of error in the Gallup polls and being slightly behind in the Harris polls. I think Nixon's judgment, much more than mine, is the relevant judgment here.
Even if it didn't. What is he doing? This is not how you're supposed to be behaving.
Right. I mean, it's
dirty.
totally unethical.
Dirty.
The day Johnson announces the bombing halt, Nixon has a rally in Madison Square Garden with his vice presidential nominee, Spiro Agnew, and he says, neither he nor I will do anything to limit the chances of peace, interfere with the chances of peace. Well, behind the scenes, he's saying boycott the peace talks.
For months.
Without any peace talks, there cannot be peace. It's that simple. Not that the beginning of peace talks would lead to peace because the two sides were very far apart.
Yeah, you could take this in a lot of areas where you don't go. Some people have gone a little crazy here that this meant, actually, the Ken Burns documentary about Vietnam, 10-part documentary, which was, I thought, generally excellent.
And I worked on it.
Oh, well, congrats. There weren't any on-camera historians, though.
No, but I helped find the tapes.
Oh, fantastic. But they do take the Chennault Affair to a conclusion that you don't. And they said because of this, the Vietnam War would continue. I mean, the Vietnam War was probably going to continue anyway.
In my opinion, yes, the Vietnam War would have continued.
I mean, they were not on the brink of a breakthrough.
They really were not. They were on the brink of a diplomatic breakthrough in the sense of starting peace talks between the North and South Vietnamese. But the two sides, us and the North Vietnamese, were so far apart. To put it in perspective, absolutely no presidential candidate in 1968 was for unilateral American withdrawal, which is how Nixon ultimately got out of it.
That's right, because the North Vietnamese kept their troops in the South. They didn't really make many concessions. 4 years later, when this thing, the so-called peace accords, which were not a peace accords.
Right, they were just a decent interval.
Yes. There's more to this story. So we just covered what happened in the Chennault Affair. But 1971, all right? Richard Nixon is meeting with his fellow hoodlums, his top aides. He's talking about how the bombing halt file, so the records about all of this stuff, is at the Brookings Institution, 2 years plus into Nixon's presidency. And he's told by Bob Haldeman that the bombing halt file is at the Brookings Institution in a safe here in Washington. Why it would be there, who knows? So why does Nixon care about this? Well, the Pentagon Papers, right? Mm-hmm. Which don't mention Nixon. But he's now, of course, even more concerned about leaks. And he's told, well, the bombing halt file is at the Brookings Institution. And this is on tape. And Ken, this is my favorite Nixon tape moment. He wants to have his people, his plumbers, break into the Brookings Institution and get the files. I think it's Kissinger who speaks up on the tape. If they have, classified documents, send the Department of Defense or the police over there and say, excuse me, do you mind handing these over?
But couldn't we go over? No, Brookings has no right to have classified.
Nixon doesn't want to do that. We'll get to the reasons why. I want to implement it on a thievery basis. God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it.
I want it implemented on a thievery basis. God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it.
Now, they never do this. For another crazy reason, right? Because they can't afford a fire truck to make it look like a firebombing. So they're showing up to put out the fire in a real fire truck so they can go into the safe and get it. This is just insanity with G. Gordon Liddy. Why was Nixon, it's like ex post facto, but he had a guilty conscience about something.
Right.
Why was he concerned about the bombing halt file?
The Chennault Affair really did lead to Watergate because even when Nixon won the election in the second closest election of the century so far, 68, the closest one being the one that Nixon lost to Kennedy in 60, he feared that there was evidence that he had interfered with the peace talks, which he had. Because when Johnson spoke to him on the telephone right before and right after the election, Johnson implied that the evidence was very solid, that people speaking for him were interfering with the peace talks and telling the South Vietnamese.
This is November 8th, 1968.
Right.
Yeah, this is a great phone call as well.
These people are proceeding on the assumption that folks close to you tell them to do nothing till January the 20th.
You got it.
Now, we think...
I know who they're talking about, too. Is it John Tower?
Well, he's one of several. Ms. Chennault is very much in there.
I call that the two ultimatum phone call because it's right after the election. Johnson is fed up that the South Vietnamese have still not shown up or even agreed to take part in the peace talks. He thinks that Nixon is to blame. And so he gets Nixon on the phone. First, he gives Nixon an ultimatum. I will make public what I know about Republican interference with the peace talks unless you deliver an ultimatum to the South Vietnamese.
Now, I don't want to say that to the country because that's not good, but they are playing that game. I don't think you're playing it, and I'd get off that hook. I'd just say to them, you go to that conference, and you protect your country, and I'm going to support our president as long as he doesn't agree to a coalition government, as long as he doesn't agree to recognize the NLF, as long as he stands on the conditions he does, and we're united, and don't depend on me to give you a better deal.
I want you or your representative to go to the South Vietnamese and tell them that they will not have the support of anyone in the Senate, Republican or Democrat, unless they send a delegation to Paris.
But you ought to go because the Fulbrights and the Mansfields and even the Dirksons will not go along with anybody that won't go to a conference table. Now, that's where they are tonight.
Let me ask you this about the ambassador. I met him about 5 or 6 months ago. Does he have any influence with that government?
Yes, he is giving them these signals, and he is telling them that he has just talked to New Mexico, and he has just talked to the Nixon people, and they say, hold out, don't do anything, we're going to win, and we'll do better by you.
That was an existential threat to South Vietnam.
Without American aid.
American aid pays for most of the South Vietnamese budget. It just will collapse without American aid. That was a huge factor in the Diem coup in 1963. It was the decisive factor in 1972 when Nixon and Kissinger forced Nguyen Van Thieu to accept the misnamed peace agreement. That really was just a decent interval agreement delaying communist takeover of South Vietnam. And in 1968, Richard Nixon, fearing the exposure of his own machinations, did send Everett Dirksen, who was then the highest-ranking Republican in the land, the Senate Minority Leader, to the South Vietnamese embassy on, I think, a Saturday morning to deliver the ultimatum saying, you guys really do have to get to the peace talks. And
at this point, because he's already won the election, it's fine if you want to do it now.
Nixon's, he said I'd give you a better deal, but he wound up not doing so.
So what you're saying here is these events, these actions, this is all in the bombing halt file. But Nixon is mistaken because there actually is no file on this.
Yeah, when Nixon becomes president, and we get this story from H.R. Haldeman, who is his chief of staff, he says, I want a complete report on everything having to do with the bombing halt. And he says it's because he thinks Johnson was playing politics with it, which is the Republicans' charge throughout the 1968 campaign.
He wants to blackmail LBJ,
right?
Who's now a former president. I mean, none of this makes sense.
H.R. Haldeman chooses Tom Charles Houston to do this report. And Houston goes through all the classified files, and he says, while it doesn't make Johnson look great, it doesn't make us look great either. In his oral history interviews with the Nixon Library, he concludes that Johnson did not pull political shenanigans in calling the bombing halt. The declassified record completely backs Johnson up. He did not make any concessions right before the election. The North Vietnamese met his demands right before the election. He was extremely reluctant to halt the bombing before the election, but Maxwell Taylor was telling him to do it.
Yeah, and if the North Vietnamese had never met the conditions, there would have been no bombing halt.
There would have been no bombing halt.
So LBJ was not the only person in charge of events here. So
he made no concessions to get the bombing halt.
Yeah. So Houston is trying to figure out how to please Nixon with the information, right?
So he puts together a bombing halt file. He gets some bad information or he misunderstands. He's told some people in Johnson's Defense Department put together a complete report on everything leading up to the bombing halt. This is kind of a garbled version of the Pentagon Papers, which is a complete report on all American decision-making leading up to Johnson's announcement of the partial bombing halt in March of 1968.
Yeah, March 31st.
Either Houston gets the story wrong or somebody told him the story wrong, and he says, these guys have a complete report on everything leading up to the bombing halt, and Leslie Gelb and Morton Halperin are at the Brookings Institution. I hear that they've got this report in their classified safe there. This is mixed up. There are a few copies of the Pentagon Papers around. There are none of them in the Brookings Institution, but Morton Halperin and Leslie Gelb do have access to a copy of that. because
it's kind of absurd. Sorry to interject.
It is
It's
absurd.
absurd on its face. Why would these smart people who work in government think that the Brookings Institution has a classified document in its safe that doesn't even exist anyway?
Right,
They don't know
right.
that.
because Nixon, it's an
Paranoid,
Edgar
yes.
Allan Poe story. Nixon's guilt shapes his view of reality.
He knows that the file incriminates him. You were talking just before about all the stuff that was going on that he was aware of. Yeah.
He thinks, because of the way Johnson threatened him, that Johnson might have the goods on Nixon.
Because of that phone call on November 8th, 1968.
Yes. In fact, Johnson bewailed that he didn't have the goods on Nixon himself and therefore really couldn't make a public accusation because he couldn't back it up. He said he didn't want to be another Joe McCarthy, making an allegation that he couldn't support.
Well, that call on November 8th, when you listen to it and read the transcript too, you can almost sense, when you ever talk to somebody and you could tell they're going along with what you're saying, but they're really hiding something.
Right.
Maybe I'm projecting here, right?
Well, maybe me too.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, because some people have come to Nixon's defense here, saying that what he did, the fact that he didn't want the peace talks to start because it might hurt his election chances is slimy and unethical and immoral to begin with. Is it possible that because Nixon was so hard to believe and lied about so many other things, including Watergate, that we just assume, well, we're not assuming, we have evidence, but we don't want to give him the benefit of the doubt here?
There are people who do that. There are people who just assume that Nixon, because he's guilty of many things, is guilty of everything. That Nixon was guilty of ordering the Watergate break-in. I don't.
On one of the tapes, he sounds surprised that this even was done. I think he goes, "Who did it? That asshole Liddy?"
Yeah.
Well, who is the asshole that did it then? Is it Liddy? Is that the fellow? He must be a little nuts. Yeah.
Yeah, Nixon thought that the Watergate break-in was kind of stupid. But he was, in my opinion, morally responsible for his campaign doing illegal things because he had said as early as 1971, I want wiretapping, I want tailing.
He set up the plumbers to do these things.
Well, he set up the plumbers to break into Brookings.
That's right. That's why you said Chennault Affair is linked to Watergate. This is the origin of the plumbers. A lot of what the plumbers did, they knew generally what they should be doing. They didn't need to take specific directions from Nixon on everything.
When they did the break-in at the psychiatrist who was treating Daniel Ellsberg, the man who leaked the Pentagon Papers, Nixon did not know about that, and that's very clear from his tapes. The weekend after that happened, Sean Ehrlichman says something happened in California. The less you know about that, the better. Nixon's like, fine, I don't want to know.
Well, the Constitution allows a president to have his own personal police force. Just breaking it off. No.
Not our Constitution.
So you said there is another piece of evidence that you recovered.
This is a piece of evidence that John Farrell recovered.
Okay.
This is the best evidence. Hats off to John Farrell. He found the evidence that Richard Nixon was directly involved in the Chennault Affair. A set of notes that H.R. Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff during the presidential campaign, as well as his chief of staff in the White House, took on October 22nd, 1968. It's a message that says M, which we believe stands for Mitchell, is to keep Anna Chennault working on the South Vietnamese, insist publicly on the 3 Johnson conditions. Now, Nixon had already been told directly by Lyndon Johnson that if the 3 conditions became public, the bombing halt deal would be over because the North Vietnamese had demanded an unconditional bombing halt. They would lose face if they acknowledged that they were accepting these 3 conditions. They had only been willing to do it secretly and with great reluctance. Nixon knew that this particular thing that he was asking for would destroy the peace talks and therefore any prospects for peace. So this is clear evidence that Richard Nixon, as candidate, violated the Logan Act, which makes it illegal for private citizens to interfere with negotiations of the U.S. government, and that he deliberately tried to torpedo the peace talks in order to help his own campaign. This is fantastic evidence. And again, John Farrell deserves the credit for finding it.
Well, I think you've made the case. I called you in my newsletter last week or the week before, a historical detective. And, today there's so much talk about the fate of our democracy. But, our country has managed to survive other stuff. We survived Watergate. It's not really a question, but, sometimes I meander. A colleague of mine, an older journalist who I used to work with, old enough at the time of Watergate to clearly remember it, he told me, during that time, he never doubted that the country would survive. But he has his doubts now. How is today different in your mind?
The only reason that the system worked in 74 was that every little piece held up properly. The free press, while most reporters stopped pursuing the Watergate story, one major journalistic institution, your major competitor, so I won't mention them by name.
No, sorry, this is not the 1970s. We can talk about our competitors. Yeah, the Washington Post, yeah.
They made sure that they continued pursuing the story even when the U.S. government in the form of the Nixon administration turned up the heat enormously, threatening their source of financial security, which was the television stations that the Washington Post owned, which provided a lot of the money to pay for investigative reporting. They came through. The courts came through. Judge John Sirica could have had a great career in Republican politics, put the law first. In Congress, things were more partisan, but a significant number of Republicans, great number of Republicans voted to authorize the impeachment inquiry. Enough Republicans voted to subpoena the tapes of the president of their own party. Some Republicans voted for the impeachment or the articles of impeachment.
Yeah, the House Judiciary Committee. Well, that's what made Goldwater go to the White House and tell Nixon that's it.
And finally, it's the leading Republicans after the release of the smoking gun tape told Nixon that they were not sure they'd support him and they're not sure he'd survive a Senate trial.
Yeah, it's easier to talk about Watergate now because the partisan passions have died down with the passage of time. We have some distance so we can look at it in a scholarly way or impartial way, right? We're assessing the facts. We're not being partisan. Today, when I talk about Trump, I have to be careful because it's very easy to sound like I'm not being impartial, but I have to call it the way I see it, right?
We must.
And it is astonishing to me that after what President Trump did on January 6th, inciting a mob, egging on a mob, incitement is a legal term, to attack another branch of government, part of his months-long plot to overturn an election, he still has the support of the party leadership. Well, he is the party leadership, but you know what I mean, Senate, everything.
In my opinion, it's a structural difference. The Republican political elite has learned that it can win presidential elections and congressional elections and control the Supreme Court without ever winning a majority of the popular vote. I mean, this is something Richard Nixon never could do. He always had to get the middle because the Republican Party was a minority. The geographic polarization it was not so advanced, and the ideological polarization. The most conservative politicians in America, as well as the most liberal ones, were in the Democratic Party in the 1960s.
Yes.
They were both poles, and the Republican Party had a much broader range of conservative to moderate to even some liberals. The system, the American Constitution, makes it possible for us to stay a democracy, a representative republic. Unfortunately, it also makes it possible for us to lose it, for us to become an authoritarian government. And at times we have been. After Reconstruction, between Reconstruction and the 1960s and the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, this was a pretty authoritarian country. I mean, there were parts of the country in the South when it was just very authoritarian.
And Jim Crow was a racial authoritarian order.
Yes.
I shall continue my personal commitment to the cause of human rights, of peace, and to the betterment of man. If I have helped in this campaign to move these causes forward, I feel rewarded. I have done my best. I have lost. Mr. Nixon has won. The democratic process has worked its will. So now let's get on with the urgent task of uniting our country. Thank you.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, it'll be the July 4th episode. What if the British had won the Revolutionary War? Why didn't they win it? Our guest will be Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy. As we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.